teachers of Reddit, what's the worst fight you had to break up? My mom had two 7th graders using chair legs to fence each other. Substitute teacher here. I was randomly assigned for the very last period of the day to a difficult class. All of these kids were enormous. Like, maybe they were football kids. All I know is my petite self wasn't even shoulder level with these kids. So in a classroom full of enormous dudes, a few in the back kept picking on one kid in the front. The seriously huge kid stood up and charged at the super big kids in the back, who all stood up, ready to fight. My super lame reaction was to slam my tiny hands on the desk and yell, "Excuse me, back in your seats please." They all just sort of stopped and looked confused, and then sat back down. No fight. No problem. Nobody was more surprised than me. I ended up leaving them some good notes for their teacher because honestly, any enormous guys who stop their big ass fight just because some tiny lady in a cardigan asks them to sit down, well, they can't be all bad. I had two girls fighting in my classroom. It turned into a hair pulling contest and my skeleton, Dr. Calcium, life drawing class, wore one of their weaves for the rest of the school year. Actual teacher here. It was after school, and I was headed to the copy room. On the way is the cafeteria, which had been cleared of all the tables, and was basically just one big empty area, except for the huge mass of students that had developed. I rushed into the massive crowd, where two different circles had formed. It was literally like being at a metal concert with two mosh pits. At least 16 kids were fighting. When I broke through, one kid fell in front of me, and the guy who pushed him ran up and did a Janikowski kick to his head. All metal moshing instincts kicked in where my main goal was to basically push away as many people as possible and keep them away from each other until more apps/officers could arrive to help. It was chaos, so I don't remember much after that. To this day I don't even know why they were fighting. Once everything was settled, I picked my paper back up and went back to making copies. I taught adults at a vocational school, mostly from rough neighborhoods. We had been warned to never try to break up a fight, as many of these students carried knives and so forth. Some woman had a bad falling out with her group of friends and was sitting separated from them. They were talking back and forth, very loudly, very aggressively across the room. I couldn't control them and went to get a supervisor. With me and the supervisor guy there, one of the girls from the group came across the room at the odd one out. She is big, 6 feet and 250 pounds, and charges across the room at the odd one out, who is maybe 2 inches. Supervisor gets in between them. They fight around him for a second, then smaller woman slashes the face of bigger woman with a razor or something. That pretty much ended it, other than a few thrown things and tussle, but a lot of hair and braids were ripped out and there was blood everywhere. Supervisor was lucky. They literally fought around him, and the smaller one whipped that blade over his right shoulder to slash the other one's face. This was on a Tuesday, and they were to effectively graduate on Thursday. Insane. The worst fight I broke up wasn't because of students getting hurt, but because of how lame it was. First off, I teach middle school, which is just one awkward moment after another. These two kids were arguing over a pencil because one kid supposedly broke the other kid's pencil. They were bickering back and forth like two old men, and then they just broke out in really mediocre wrestling. It was embarrassing to watch because neither boy could even wrestle, and I was able to just tell them to stop and send them to the office with no other issues. Another reason it was the lamest fight ever was because all the other students who were working at other tables went about their work and talking to each other and didn't even notice. Usually they would be chanting fight, fight, over and over, and crowding around trying to film for World Star. I had a student who fought a few times in my class and was one of those blind rage type fighters who would just swing at anyone until he got back under control. He was manageable in my class, but he was sent to homeschooling after a fight he got into in the hallways. Something stupid set him off, and he punched the other kid a few times before being restrained by one of the security guards, who he also punched in the face. During the same fight, a teacher was trying to separate the two students, and he accidentally, but still, broke 2 of her fingers. It dawned on me that day why they tell us to not get between students fighting. She was lucky that 1, she wasn't hurt worse, and 2, that she wasn't written up on disciplinary charges for breaking that rule. I've only broken up a few fights, and they were pretty mundane, but if there is one thing I know, is that girls' fights are worse than boys. Girls will go for your eyes, but boys typically stick to an honor code, no hits below the belt and all that. I'm an English teacher in France. This happened in the classroom next door to mine, and I just witnessed the aftermath and heard the gossip from my friend, who did break it up, and was there to hear the story when they got hauled into the admin's office. One of my male students was named Timothy, who was dating a girl named Anna a year under him. One day last year he apparently left his phone unattended and unlocked, and she picked it up and started searching through it. What Anna found was his very male best friend Louis sexting and sending him nudes and talking about how much he loved him, and Tim was texting back and being equally enthusiastic about the two of them being together out in the open once they finished school and were in university. She proceeded to screenshot and send all those texts, sexts and nudes to her boyfriend's parents before replacing his phone so he wouldn't know. Tim's parents are very conservative, and when I say very, I mean very. His mother once called me to complain about his grade in English, and it evolved into a rant about foreign students that would make Marine Le Pen proud, and Anna knew, so that's why she went this revenge route. This kid went home to be blindsided thanks to her, and apparently he had to basically flee the house because he was afraid of his father literally killing him. Louis turned up to school the next day, calmly entered Anna's first period class, and beat the ever-loving shit out of her. Just wailed on her. He was skinny thing, but knew what he was doing, and she was super tiny, and it was not a fair fight at all, and he just obliterated her. I just heard him screaming after he had been restrained, witches, when I went to go check. She had a black eye and a broken eye socket, and there was blood everywhere from her mouth and nose. Louis was borderline hysterical and screaming about her being a bee who ruined Tim's life. It was bad. Not a teacher, but in my low-income urban public school we had an actual riot, with students punching police officers, tripping the fire alarm, damaging property, and screaming obscenities. School was cancelled for 2 days as teachers reviewed security footage and suspended kids. Of course, it was a doozy to break up. A lot of dissatisfied kids in the cities. I'm not a teacher, but I have worked in K-12 ed for 10 years, so I have been in a lot of classrooms. Teachers aren't supposed to break up fights, and usually get hurt trying to do so. That being said, the worst fight I saw was in a science lab. I was in the back of the lab installing some software to go with a digital microscope, and a large 8th grade girl was singing disrespectfully while the teacher was talking. Tiny 8th grade girl behind her was getting pissed and telling her to shut up because she couldn't hear what the teacher was saying. Big girl continued to sing. Tiny girl says for the last time, "Shut the F up, I'm trying to learn." Then proceeds to leap over the lab table between them, grabs the big girl's hair, and proceeds to bash her face into the table over and over again, screaming at her to shut the F up. They had to get a very large male administrator in there to pull her off. The teacher got elbowed in the face when she tried to step in, said screw it, and ran out into the hall to get an admin. Fun times. My dad is a 5 feet 6 inches Hispanic dude, gentlest person you can imagine. His first teaching job was at a rough high school. 2 guys, both much bigger than him, got into it, but security was nowhere to be found, so he tackled them both in a bear hug, so all they could do was stare at each other in rage while my dad waited for reinforcement. I taught for 2 years in a very rough boys school where I had to break up fights almost daily. I'll share 3 stories. The first fight was when 2 students started fighting because of, well, I can't quite remember, to be honest. It probably started as an argument over which one's mother is a bigger whore, or maybe who owed who drug money. The fighters were grade 9 aged. It took 4 staff members to break the 2 apart, and even more to keep them separated after the initial blows. At the height of the chaos, both were throwing chairs, tables, and whatever else they could get their hands on. The end result was damaged windows, broken doors, and quite a few staff members that had cuts/scrapes/bruises from trying to keep the 2 away from each other. I'm pretty sure they met up outside school to settle their differences later that week. The second story is a bit more lighthearted. In my first few months of teaching at the school, I rewarded a group for good behavior by taking them to play soccer on their small hard court area. When I say good behavior, I mean they hadn't assaulted or verbally abused each other in my class all week. Even though I was still new, I felt like I could trust them since they had been relatively well behaved and they were a small group. In the middle of the game, which was going great by the way, two players from opposite teams had a moment of frustration and started swinging haymakers. They both got a few good shots in, and by the time I was able to get in between them the fight was over. We took a 5-minute break, they shook hands and we continued the game. I didn't write them up for that one. The last story is one of the few times where I legitimately thought I would have to defend myself. I was on duty at the hard court during break, and I challenged a student on his behavior. He had been picking on a younger student, and all I had asked for him to do was stop. When he kept doing it, I approached and told him that he had to leave the hard court area. Once I was within 5 meters or so, he turned on me. He started telling me to F off and cursing at me with every word in his vocabulary. Everything seemed to slow down at this point as he started to walk towards me with what I could feel was an intent to hurt. At the same time though, I could sense the other students watching and starting to move closer towards us. I began stepping back while talking to him, trying to de-escalate the situation, and I even outstretched my arm towards him to try to keep space between us. Before the student was able to fully reach me, he was turned and escorted away by 3 other students. As of a situation as that was, to me that incident had a silver lining. Even though at times I'm sure they all had their differences with me, that day I felt lucky to have those boys as my students. I'm not sure what would have happened if they hadn't stepped in, but I do know it would not have been a positive outcome.